Chapter 34. Trinity. It came back to her now. A child, new to the ministry halls, new to the bed that her benevolent Savior had provided, and to her new identity. She had been unable to sleep. She had wandered the corridors, searching for the stabilizing force just introduced into her life, her uncle. Around him she could be Sabrina Sabria, and the memories of that other girl, Annalise Cole, exiled to the boat on a painted sea, seemed farther away. Sabrina found her uncle's office empty and wandered into the council room, a small child lost among the oversized chairs. A candle burned in the alcove with pictures, but not nearly as many as she would see years later. She had discovered this same tunnel many years ago, where grown-up Sabrina now searched, and at its end, her uncle, working away beneath a silver globe perched on a column with 4 silver arms. His brow was furrowed at the connected wires and cables, referencing a palm screen resting on his thigh. He was startled but not angry when he saw her standing there in her pajamas, and he took her up quickly in his arms.
A failsafe,
Dag had called it. Now, many years later, she felt as if she were looking upon the same scene, her uncle beneath the silver globe, but this time trying to lower a glass case suspended from a column in the ceiling. A steel tube that telescoped down over the glass cylinder was attached to the case. Somehow she knew this sphere was the trigger of the weapon Theopin wanted. And I have seen it in my dreams, so many times. Dag was dressed in white trousers and a white shirt open at the chest. A blue jacket hung over shoulders which were more stooped and sunken than she remembered. His circle of silver hair was whiter, and his skin had become paler. It was as if he had aged years in the few weeks she had been gone. He leaned on his staff for support, its tip clicking on the floor with every step. He noticed neither the Elved nor Sabrina. His attention was riveted on the glass case, a barrier to seal off the trigger, a barrier that jammed as it had descended. The room was spacious, the emptiness echoing with the sound of the storm, the rain rattling the windows high up near the ceiling. The dark glass a stark contrast to the white interior. Dag worked on the weapon, oblivious to Sabrina, turning his head every so often to look at something behind him. She maneuvered around the Elved's bulk to see more clearly, and gasped. The pounding she heard was not the sound of rain and thunder alone, but the hammering of rebels locked out by a glass barrier, reinforced with an embedded metal fencing. Sabrina immediately recognized Rickard, Vards, and Naelis, wearing their stolen helmets. The 3 rebels swung at the door with sledges and axes, the glass splintering in clouds of white. Their comrades applied laser torches and pneumatic drills to the edges, and Sabrina could see other rebels bent over paneling enclosing the biochemical snifters, trying to short them out. A second door opened with a gust of air, and a single figure stood there, looking up and down at the frame of the door as if pleased and surprised that it opened. Theopin. Sabrina knew him by his dun-colored robe, which he had donned as if he was not a part of a raid, but a ceremony. His face was the same, but his head was radically altered, no longer human. His boyish hair was gone, his skull bulged upwards like a giant egg, elongated and swollen. Tracks of stitches knitted together the mismatched patches of skin covering his elongated scalp. Sabrina recalled the operating theater deep within the caves, in the desert, and Theopin's mysterious disappearance. The red, inflamed incisions had not had time to heal properly before the invasion was launched. His face glowed with a sheen of sweat. His eyes, despite the bright glare of the room, were dilated. Theopin raised his arms in a sudden swoop, his face turned upwards as if in thanks to his master. His men on the far side of the gate grew still for a moment, unsure whether to pray or to cheer. His arms aloft, he gazed triumphantly about the room, Dagosta laboring to draw down the glass case, the Elved listing to the side, and Sabrina hunched over her own mortal wound. Mild surprise registered on his face at the sight of her, one eyebrow arching for just a moment before the shock melted into a smile, as if to say, "It's all meant to be." and that he would accept the players present on the stage his master had set. More rebels stampeded down the corridor behind Theopin, but as soon as they neared the entrance to the room, an alarm sounded. The security gate slammed shut, blocking their way, their panting breath clouding on the glass as their palms were pressed white against it. Dagosta spun around at the noise and was astounded to see Theopin.
Who are you? How did you enter here?
Is that any way to greet your son, father? Dag seemed in shock, his head shaking and his lips moving soundlessly in disbelief, his eyes darting from the rebels held behind the door and the man standing before him. Even I stand surprised, for it seems I have a sister whom I never knew. Theopin nodded to Sabrina, and her uncle noticed her for the first time.
Sabrina!
Whether it was her presence or the Elved or both, Dag seemed to lose his composure again as he saw the injuries suffered by Sabrina and the Elved. He turned to Theopin.
I don't know who you are, but I am not your father, and she is not your sister.
He's Theopin, Sabrina said. He's their leader. But I am your son. The proof is in your own security system, father, said Theopin. Only those with biochemical signatures close to your own can enter the most sacred of your sanctums. Is it not true? Theopin raised his chin and breathed deeply, his smile inextinguishable. I understand some explanation is needed. A single name might suffice. Rashud, Akifa, Jadana. But I believe you simply called her Jade. Dag's face went white. He swayed as if he was going to collapse. He leaned heavily on his staff, his fingers clutching it so tightly that Sabrina thought it would break. The Elved turned his head in Theopin's direction. Theopin's face was unrestrained joy. Yes, she meant something to you, didn't she? He said. She studied under you, helped you develop your technology. Despite your affair and the love you professed for her, you still ordered her to undergo the treatment, like all of your students, their identities secondary in importance to your secrecy, to your control of your own technology, your own world.
It was the only way,
Dag whispered, bent double as if in pain.
It was your way!
Theopin spat, his face twisted in a sudden, naked rage.
But she did not follow your instructions, he said, stalking closer. She faked the treatment out of some attachment to you. She wanted to remember you, even if it meant pain. She wanted to remember the man she loved.
Theopin shook his head as if there was nothing in this world more repulsive than what he had described. His lips curled and his nose wrinkled. He spat on the floor near Dag's feet. Dag's hands began to lose their grip on the staff, sliding down its length, his body weakening as if Theopin was raining physical blows upon him. The picture of the olive-skinned woman on Dag's desk flashed in Sabrina's mind. That sorrowful face, those eyes full of empty longing. Now that she knew, she could see the same feature in Theopin's face, right alongside Dag's. Why didn't I see it? To her surprise, there was something more for her to remember you by, Theopin said. Shortly after she moved to Lysander to assume the life you had planned for her, she discovered she was pregnant.
She never told me.
Dag's voice was barely audible.
No, she did not. Out of some misplaced sense of loyalty to you, and perhaps afraid of what you might do to the child. I thought it best to leave her alone. The burden of longing only mine. But it was not. She loved you. And the burden grew on her. You can imagine the loneliness of living in a place where everyone around you lives a lie, planted deep within them, and only you know the truth. Then, of course, there was the shame of betraying you, our dear leader, our great savior, her great love. It killed her. I watched her withdraw from the world, wither and die. But on her deathbed she confessed what she could to me. That was when I knew you were the evil one, and that your slaves must rise up against the demon in their midst and smite you."
Dag had taken 3 steps forward, then collapsed to his knees, weeping into his hands.
"Can you ever forgive me, son?"
"Forgiveness? I would sooner offer a snake a place in my home. All I want, all we want, is your annihilation. Because that is what the Master wants. You are an instrument of the enemy. It has been a long road to this point. He has tested us, but our faith sustained us. And that is my proof that we are righteous in our mission to save this world from your folly, your lies." "It is only proof that you are mad," Sabrina said, reaching for her blaster, only to find she had lost it in the chaos fleeing the laboratory. Theopin smiled at her empty holsters, as if her helplessness was further proof of his cause, a small miracle from his master. "You should know, Dagosta, that it was Sabrina who helped me, and more importantly, my men, to see the light. I could never have led them this far without her." The pain increased across Sabrina's abdomen. She was left with only words to hurl.
"Don't believe him, Dag. He twists things."
"Your own technology will aid us," Theopin announced, his preacher's voice rising to fill the great hall. "We will bend the world to his will, or destroy it in holy fire. And I am protected from your control completely." He gestured to his deformed head. Sabrina finally understood what he had done.
"You've implanted a helmet into your own skull."
"So it can never be removed. This way, the only voice I will ever hear is the voice of God. Not Dagosta."
"You don't understand,"
Dag said.
"You've only ruined yourself."
"I have saved myself and the thousands who follow me." Dag ran his hands across his balding head, so small in comparison to the grotesque deformity that was Theopin's. Dag spoke again, addressing no one in particular.
"I prayed for you. Prayed for all of you. All of the people who had to be treated."
Dag's confession stopped Theopin, and for the first time, the smile left his face. Sabrina was not sure what her uncle meant, but she dug the necklace she had taken from the alcove out of her pocket and flung it at Theopin's feet. "It's true. I found his sanctuary. He has pictures of all the scripts ever processed. He has a picture of your mother. The necklace was hers." Dag spread his hands wide, staring at the necklace on the floor, curled like a lock of fallen, glistening hair.
"It was a simple, sentimental habit. Praying. A comfort to an old man that I had hoped would die with me, allowing the world to continue without such practices."
"Die with you?" Theopin said. Sabrina could not contain her own impulse. "Why, Dag? Why all this?" she asked, waving her hand at the room around them and the world outside of it he had created. "Why the lies?" The muscles in Dag's jaw flexed, the skin around his eyes crinkled, and the ends of his mouth tipped downward. Some might mistake his expression for sorrow, but Sabrina knew him well, and she sensed the anger coming, building within him.
"Because I grew up watching each side murder one another,"
he said, seething, his eyes locked ahead but unfocused, as if he were again witnessing countless atrocities in his mind.
"Each of them so convinced of their righteousness, so contemptible of the other side, this side, that side, the good side, the bad side, when really it was simple. There was a side that wanted peace and a side that wanted war. Those at war did not realize they were on the same side. The side that wanted death, to perpetuate hate, violence, righteousness. Religion had poisoned their minds so they could not see the humanity in one another. What if I could remove the offending agent? What if I could remove the memories of the hurt and pain? The revenge, the recrimination, the ignorance. And then maybe the suffering would end.
He dropped his face into his hands.
I have made so many mistakes. Can you forgive me, my son?
You will not receive absolution from me, Theopin said, sneering in disgust. He marched towards his father, the hem of his robes flaring as he stepped close to Dag. But his hand closed around the end of Dag's staff to disarm him. Dag's expression changed from supplication to resistance. Dag's thumb moved over a switch on the staff, and blades flared out of the sides, one punching through the flesh of his son's hand. Theopin cried out while Dag rose to his feet, the strength and nimbleness Sabrina knew returned. His pleading had been a feint. He swung the shaft over his head, and the room echoed with a crack as he struck Theopin's head. The glass on both doors fogged again with the cries of the rebels as their pounding resumed. The doorways flashed with the reckless discharge of plasma rifles and sparks as bullet caromed from door to wall. Dag continued battering his son, pausing only to depress a switch on the staff again. The blades on top retracted, and a single long knife shot out from the foot of the cane. Dag raised it over Theopin's side as the pounding protest on the doors rose like the clamor of wild drums.
"Stop, Dag!" Sabrina yelled. "He's your son! There is a larger world at stake here. He must die to save many!"
Her uncle shouted, his face flushed and red, his chest heaving from exertion. But Theopin was not ready to die. He snatched the end of the staff in his hand and flung it away from his father's grip. It clattered to a stop far across the room. Theopin stumbled as he stood, but he steadied himself right before throwing himself at Dag. He used his uninjured hand to punch his father, striking his face, his other arm swinging uselessly, leaving a trail of blood. Theopin kneed his father in the stomach and groin, as Dag grabbed at Theopin's head, all stitches and tender red flesh, clawing at the incisions. Theopin howled, and Dag reached to choke him, striking at his head whenever his son tried to escape his grasp. But youth aided Theopin, and with a twist he tumbled his father off him. They struggled hand to hand again, with neither one holding the advantage. As the father and son grappled, the emergency gates bowed inward, the glass splintering and tinkling onto the floor. The voices of the rebel soldiers came through gaps they had smashed in the doors. Their numbers had grown as they converged on Dag's sanctum. They filled both corridors now, down the halls as far as Sabrina could see. Before long, they would be able to slip their weapons into the openings and fire. The contest between Theopin and Dagosta shifted again. Sabrina's head felt light, her stomach woozy, her heart beating out of rhythm. A wide puddle of blood had gathered on the floor beneath her, staining her boots and pants. Above it all, the silver globe lurked, its danger cloaked in sleek beauty. 4 levers branching from the central support pillar surrounded the orb. A small gap circled its center like a planet's equator, indicating where the upper hemisphere clicked downward to meet the lower. A blast shattered a portion of one of the doors. A bolt of plasma followed, passing above Dag's head as he struggled with Theopin. He caught sight of Sabrina as she yanked down the first lever, her arms burning from the effort.
"Sabrina, wait!"
Dag was cut short as Theopin, blood seeping from his stitches, leapt on him and tried to take him to the floor, her uncle's shirt ripping with the force and baring his naked chest. Sabrina pulled the second lever. It clicked loudly into place. She moved to the third, but the Elved had shifted its bulk down low next to her, his ruined, shattered face reflecting her own distraught expression a dozen times over the fragmented pieces. "Merciless Mother, origin and devourest of all things," its screen said. She saw incomprehension in her own reflection, just as she had with number 9 out in the desert with Sprocket. But the Elved was undeterred. He reached into its own torso where a number of cables had been frayed and severed. He ripped the remaining ones from their sockets. A chorus of alarms blared. He moved again, his arm brushing so close to Sabrina that she flinched, but his motions towards her were deliberate and gentle. His fingers probing another compartment on his left hip, he drew open the hatch and removed a power cell, severing the wires that trailed from it like entrails. Green lettering flashed on his screen, flickering. There must be less than 10. Can a machine go mad? The compartment on his right hip was damaged, and he had to wrestle with it in pathetic motions as his lamed arm began to malfunction. He finally tore open the hatch and removed the last cell. 10 what? But the screen went blank with the removal of the final power cell. The frame of the Elved shuddered, turbines and servos overheating as cooling fans shut down. The legs locked and the entire body crumpled unceremoniously, fluid draining, hydraulics collapsing with long, drawn-out hisses, like breath leaving a body, until the machine was still and inert, the life in it gone. The human tissue behind that facade of steel and glass dying. Can a machine have faith? Dag was crying out, but his voice was distant as Sabrina placed a hand on the curved face of the Elved. Her uncle had forgotten that lesson he had taught her so long ago. The human mind, even his, was wired for belief, for the supernatural. A spirit in the sprockets. Left in their own space, even the Elveds had pulled what they could from the ether, from the incomprehensible signals of a world they were forbidden to enter. Somehow from it all, they had formed their own faith. With me at the center, the origin and devourest of all things. This is what madness looks like. This is faith. Her uncle surrendered after that, not even resisting as his son wrapped the sleeve he had torn from his own robe around Dag's neck. He choked his father until his breath was but a whisper, and then stopped, hearing the fourth lever click down into place. "Sister Sabrina," Theopin said. A horde of murderous faces pressed against the glass. The second door began to shake and bow inward as the metal fencing within started to give way. Cries of victory rang out. Theopin called her name as she stretched her hand over the sphere. "Sabrina, wait!" She regarded him over her extended arm. Blood trickled down his face from his gaping sutures, while his eyes burned with a fervor she had not seen before. The pain in her abdomen was becoming unbearable. She fought to keep her hand from shaking while her legs felt sticky and hot with her own blood. She looked steadily at him. "My name is Annalise." Theopin slowly stood, his hands together, his lips moving without sound, as if he could not decide upon what name to use. He took a step forward. More glass rained down from one of the doors, broken shards scattering across the floor. "Please pause and think, sister. This weapon has been given to us to convert the unbelieving. It is a gift of the Master. Do you not believe in his will, even now as we stand together at the brink of his holy kingdom?" She made a fist as a new thread of pain wound through her torso and pulled with unrelenting force. It took all her concentration, all her will to remain standing. "I believe now, Theopin. I believe in a new beginning." She looked at him as she opened her fist, casting a shadow, darkness over a silver planet, her blood leaving spots on the smooth surface of the weapon. She was aware of the rebels, the smell of them, the desert filth, smoke, soot, sweat, semen, and blood. The odor of rapists and murderers. She was aware of the broken, half-human machine beside her, believing in its last moments that it had sacrificed itself so others might live. She was aware of her uncle's pleading eyes as he lay on the floor. She was aware of her own life draining away from her. And she was aware of Lindsey standing at the doorway, her trembling lips smiling. Most of all, she was aware of an empty sailboat on a choppy silver sea, its lone passenger finally free. "I lied, Lindsey. I don't believe. I never will.
I hope my story is the right one.
She closed her eyes and dropped her hand. An electric buzzing, a circuit board shorting, a billion locusts humming, a live wire flailing in a storm, the noise increasing to such a pitch that it sounded like a hiss of breath through clenched teeth, a hiss that turned into a whirlwind. The rebels fell to the floor, clutching their ears. A window shattered, and a gust of heat caught Theopin, knocking him aside as if by an invisible fist and igniting his robes with wings of flame. He tumbled and collapsed, a silhouette in weeping fire. Thunder far below their feet shook the walls. The telescoping cover for the trigger swayed. The wreckage of the Elved rattled. Dag knelt, closed his eyes, and covered his face with his hands, his skin aglow from the growing inferno that was his son. The remaining windows exploded with a flash from outside. Heat poured down on all of them. Bars of light and shadow warred on the walls as the room dissolved in light. The brightest light Sabrina had ever seen. Light. Light. Chapter 35. Sylvia. Sean brought the desert runner to a stop, the whir of the turbines spinning down in a low hum, the rotors ticking over in a slowing progression. 14 children younger than 10, 8 mothers, 3 teenage girls, 2 teenage boys, 1 other male officer. 28 people in all were packed into the cab and rear bed. All they could fit in the mad scramble out of Fortinbras. Now not a single one seemed to breathe. The wall loomed over them, a sheer towering cliff with blank, implacable windows for eyes, crowned with red signal lights burning against the evening sky. Before daylight had faded, Sean had spotted plumes of dust rising to either side as other convoys of vehicles ran in parallel paths. They were other bands of city dwellers, bands of people fleeing the violence, bands of people who also thought to try their luck at the wall. People I convinced. We should have stayed together. But they had not. The flight was too haphazard, chaotic. Perhaps it was better this way, especially if he was wrong. Better their numbers were scattered. Sabrina, I hope you are right. He had not mentioned who had told him to seek the wall. His cadet, a girl, an outlaw. He had simply acted as if he were free of doubt, as a commander in crisis, which, for all intents and purposes he had become, ought to do. They had looked to him for security, safety, certainty. He would provide it. Until he couldn't. And Sabrina had afforded it to him. She had rematerialized like some phantom from a dream. It hardly seemed real, but there she was, in an alleyway with those children, bloody and bruised, the dust of the desert hanging about her like an aura. She was as he remembered her, and at the same time transformed. She had ordered him with such certainty, such authority, that he had simply obeyed, never doubting the truth of what she said. And she had kissed him. The thought still made his head feel light, and his hands shake. The entire episode was unreal, even more so than the insanity they had witnessed that day. He had to look occasionally at the 3 children sleeping in the seats behind him. Nani, Drim, and Amat, to convince himself the encounter had happened at all. Ryan, the other officer, was wounded and could not walk. They had strapped him to the frame of the runner and helped him sit upright and cover the rear of the vehicle with his plasma rifle. He wasn't going to be unstrapped easily. Other officers had remained in the city to help more survivors, or commandeer other vehicles to drive citizens to safety. So Sean knew he would have to get out and approach the wall himself, alone. His mouth was parched. He had not paused in their flight, not to rest, not to drink, not to retape his broken fingers or replace the bloody bandages itching beneath his suit. Reaching the wall was all that mattered.
"Go north," Sabrina had said. "Go to the wall. Get as far from the city as possible. There will be people at the wall to help you."
She had promised. He had believed her. Now they were parked at the edge of everything they knew, the edge of what habitable land was left on the surface of the planet, the edge of life. The daylight was running out, and he wondered if he had made the right choice. He reached for a canteen that one of the young women in the cab held out to him, and took a long drink. He knew he should conserve. They had no supplies, and if Sabrina was wrong about help, they would be on their own in the desert, with 29 requiring food, water, and shelter. If she were wrong, they might be wandering a long time, or an automated security system might shoot them after a few steps. If this was the last drink he would ever taste, he would at least savor it. He held the water in his mouth for a moment before swallowing. He replaced the cap and wiped his lips, tugging on them gently as if he could bring back the sensation of Sabrina's mouth. He handed the canteen back to the girl, a redhead, pretty in a plain way. She might have been older than her teens, for she had handled the children and other teenagers with a firm calmness that spoke of maturity. She had also helped him navigate, remaining resolute even as the runner tipped, and at times came close to rolling as they careened over uneven terrain. He pulled his blaster from its holster on the side of his seat as he stepped out of the runner. He closed the door behind him and motioned for the girl to slide over into his seat.
"If they take me out, you turn this thing around and get out of here," he said through the window.
"I will," she said. As her lips parted, he noticed a gap where she was missing a tooth. He'd seen men in the boxing ring lose the same tooth, and for a second wondered at the girl's story before he stepped away from the runner and towards the wall. Gravel crunched under his feet. The wall stood in a bed of packed earth, the sides flaring outwards and the ground dusted with a powder of granular material that weathered off the surface. There was a door, the metal rusted at the base of the tower. Desiccated weeds grew in front of it. He and the girl had talked about the wall on their journey throughout the afternoon. The wall was automated, so it must be abandoned. The idea of people who could help them, preposterous and against everything they knew. But so was widespread madness, rebels filling the streets of Fortinbras and overrunning the head ministry.
"Lies, Sean," Sabrina had told him. "We've been told so many lies."
He had thought of driving to Lysander, but how did they know the same madness had not spread there, or that there would not be rebels waiting to ambush them on the coast road? Could there be something more, something else at the wall aside from an irradiated waste? Sabrina had convinced him. He had convinced others. Now they sat huddled behind him, waiting. He stopped halfway between the wall and the runners. If he was shot down here, he hoped the girl would have time to turn the vehicle and flee.
Should have turned it around first.
Too late for that. The windows above reflected the clouded sky. The sight brought him a sliver of hopefulness.
Why have windows if there were not watchers within?
He waved his arms and cried out,
"Help! I have wounded women and children! Help!"
The windows remained blank and empty. His arms grew tired, his voice weak. The weeds before the door rustled in the breeze. A dervish of sand spun up and collapsed against the face of the wall. With no response, he began to wonder if it was worth blasting open the door and sheltering inside. He was considering which setting would break through the metal when something on the far side struck the door with a bang. It swung open slowly, the metal protesting with a screech. 2 men in gray suits, much like his own, stepped out. Their eyes were covered in visors, the same make and model as all security ministry officers. The sight of them was expected, and yet strange. Sean felt a rising bubble of incredulity in his chest. It escaped from him in a relieved laugh.
"I can't believe it. She was right."
Both officers aimed plasma rifles at his chest, but their fingers rested outside the trigger guards. Their eyes were covered by their visors.
Place your weapon on the ground and take 3 steps back, one said in a strangely accented voice.
Sean obeyed.
I have women, children, and 1 officer. He's also armed.
They moved closer. One officer picked up Sean's blaster. The other zoomed in on his face with his visor. He asked Sean to pull down the skin below his eye. He did so, and after a moment his interrogator lowered his rifle.
How many in that runner are 39 or older?
I'm not sure. Maybe 3 or 4.
Any confusion or violent outbursts among them?
We're all confused.
They are all scared. No fighting among them? No attacking?
No, but plenty in the city. People are going mad. The men nodded and one spoke into his communicator.
Clear.
A dozen figures, women and men, filed out of the doorway. They carried med kits, wore white coveralls and blue helmets, much like the officers. A woman who seemed to be in charge asked Sean a battery of questions. How many in the runner? How many children? How many wounded? Any visibly sick with infectious diseases? They all spoke with such strange accents, some of which he could not understand, and the 2 men in patrol suits had to repeat some of the questions for him. He tried to remain focused, but the strangeness was disorienting. So many people from within the wall. The confusion must have shown on his face.
Everything you know is inside the walls here?
One of the men said, now looking at Sean with naked curiosity. Sean took a moment to absorb the question. Inside? Of course, inside. Did that mean there was an outside?
Yeah,
was all he could muster.
You all part of the ministry?
The what? One said.
No, we're not,
the other said. He lifted his visor so he could look Sean in the eye.
Brother, you are going to have to be strong. A lot is about to change for you.
We've been told so many lies. Sean was unsteady on his feet. His gut, down to his bowels, felt as it was roiling with poison.
I'm afraid I don't understand yet. We can't really say more. Protocols on how refugees are supposed to be debriefed.
Refugees. Sean turned the word over in his mind.
There were survivors after the cataclysm, weren't there? You all are from the other side.
The officer nodded. Sean did not remember sitting down, but found himself on the ground, his fist to his mouth, willing his head to stop spinning, his stomach not to turn inside out. The 2 men were immediately on the ground beside him. One called over a female medic. She chided them.
Too much, too soon.
The closest one scoffed.
They are going to learn sooner or later. None of it's going to be easy.
Sean insisted he was all right, even though it was a lie.
Just let me know as you let the others know. Tell me as you tell them. I don't want the knowledge alone.
A medic gave him a cup of warm liquid that did not wash away the knot in his stomach, but calmed him so he could stand again. He thanked the men in patrol suits who appeared to consider him a sort of brother in arms. But Sean wasn't ready to have his world dismantled so quickly. They intimidated him, and, like a child, he yearned for something familiar. He walked back to the runner, mumbling about checking on the children. The medics had helped almost everyone out of the runner. Ryan, the wounded officer, was last, and they were moving him into a stretcher. His traveling companions now wore blankets protectively about their shoulders, though it was hardly cold. The runner's cab was abandoned, an emptiness that struck Sean as overwhelmingly sad. He steadied himself against the door frame.
You all right?
The red-haired girl had come up without his noticing. Unlike the other refugees, she had not taken a blanket. Instead, she held a clutch of water bottles in her hands. She gave one to Sean. It tasted a lot better than the stale water from his canteen.
They are survivors of the cataclysm,
he said. The young woman nodded, her eyes unblinking.
You're not shocked?
Nothing shocks me after what we saw in the streets today,
she said. Sean poured some of the water from his canteen into his hands and rubbed away dried blood. Some was his. The adhesive on his fingers gave out, and the tape began to peel.
You should have them look at those,
the girl said. She reached for his hand, but never touched it. There was a searing flash from the south. Evening turned back into day, a long, sustained blaze of lightning. Sean felt heat on the side of his face, as if he were next to a heater grill. Shadows stretched for the north, for the wall. Medics shielded their faces with one hand and tried to cover the faces of the refugees with the other. Sean had to turn his eyes away as well. The light was overpowering, like a star come to rest on the seam of land and sea that was Fortinbras.
Isa,
the girl said. The light faded and the sky glowed as a swirl of white cloud loomed upwards, red from within and punching through the dark thunderheads. The faces of the storm clouds were cleaved apart and rearranged in ragged precipices. Lightning flashed at the boundaries between storm and the churning updraft. The heavens were at war with themselves. Thunder followed, a rumbling boom that came on like an ocean wave, shaking the ground so much that even the runner rocked on its suspension, as if it were rolling across the ground at full speed. Some of the children began to cry.
Right, Sabrina, you better be safe.
Sean winced as the redhead began to unwrap his fingers.
Just like that, back to my fingers. Fortinbras may have just been leveled.
But we are safe. And so are all the people you got out, she said. You did what you had to do. Now I'm doing what I do. You did your job. You saved us. She turned her head to look at the wall. In both directions, other runners were rolling up to the wall's base in clouds of dust, while white-clad medics and gray-suited soldiers spilled out of doorways along its surface.
Sabrina saved us.
Who?
My friend. Told me to get to the wall. Then I told everyone else.
Then she saved a lot of people.
She gestured towards more runners approaching the wall in the distance, refugees clinging to their sides and rooftops. There had to be dozens of runners, maybe even 1,000 people. Refugees. She began unwrapping his other fingers, using the remaining water in his canteen to unstick the tape. Sean would not have admitted it, but he was glad for the touch of another person.
You weren't scared this whole time?
He said. The girl shrugged.
You didn't seem to be either.
I was. I just couldn't show it. It's my job, like you said. But it's not yours. Just ice water in your veins, or were you going into shock?
I'm fine.
She said it convincingly. She held his unwrapped hand still in her own.
I was scared for the kids. I did not want them to get hurt.
But I knew I was going to live.
How?
I don't have my own kids yet.
Maybe now I do, she said, nodding to the 3 children Sabrina had given him. 2 medics were bent over them. Amat, wide-eyed and alert, held Drim. Nani sucked her thumb, and Sean was glad to see a female medic wrap her in a blanket and take her in her arms. The redhead continued. A weird girl in school once told me I'd grow up. She had visions a lot. Told me she saw me with kids, my own.
The vision of a ranting kid off her medications gave you solace?
The girl stared out into space.
She was right about a lot of things. In a pinch, I needed something.
What happened to her?
I don't know.
She touched a finger to her lip for a heartbeat.
Wish I'd been kinder to her.
The medics came over and urged them through the opening in the wall. The women and children wrapped in blankets were already disappearing into the doorway as the 2 armed men stood by protectively, their eyes fixed on the turmoil in the sky over Fortinbras. The girl said she wanted to check on the children.
Come on, we'll retape those fingers.
In a minute.
Sean looked back at the cab of the runner, its seats still indented with the phantoms of its passengers. His canteen was empty. He tossed it on the runner floor and slammed the door. It clattered inside, like a pebble in an empty shell. The sky above Fortinbras was still reeling, lightning cracked the cloud faces while mist eddied at their feet. He could feel a swirl of dust and raindrops on his cheeks. He closed his eyes, his lips moving with silent thoughts before he steadied himself on the frame of the runner and kicked the tires, dislodging dirt caked to his feet. Fat flakes fell to the earth. Sean let go of the runner, turned his back, and walked toward the open door.